Was I as pure as the driven snow throughout this process? Absolutely not, because despite the requirement that black women abdicate our humanity, I am a person first. There were crushes and unprofessional arguments, and when I think about how I could have avoided debt by simply accepting that the dominant narrative is too enticing for people to change, I can fall into a deep depression. I did the best I could with the information I had, but the problem was that I continued to, one, believe in institutions that I knew to be lying on a regular basis, two, believe in the integrity of people who showed me that they believed me to be beneath them, and three, keep putting my money where my mouth was when no one else was doing the same. Ironically, as I was writing this, my former deciphercity.org colleague attempted to extract my financial resources to keep up the site despite resigning 4 years ago, and I had to fight with the company holding the site to retrieve my money. Passion, drive, resilience, or whatever nonsense people want to call it, I should have had less, and I might have ended up breaking even instead of being racked with high interest debt while most of the people around me stayed comfortable, sacrificing nothing and maintaining good reputations. Among the activism that I did, the most enjoyable groups I joined were Food Not Bombs, which was a collaboration with a local grocer and biking organizations. We would get together and cook food and then ride around and distribute the food to unhoused encampments. I lasted for about 3 or 4 months and then I stopped hearing about it. But I met an organizer a year or so later, and she mentioned that the grocery store stopped collaborating. Lend Your Legs involved riding in tandem with people who were visually impaired, and that was a fun experience because riding a tandem bicycle is simply fun. Sadly, I overheat quickly, and I stopped after about 3 months due to heat. But someone else I knew said that the group stopped going out, probably because of the heat. Riding bicycles and doing activism felt rewarding for both parties, but climate change has made the heat something else, and doing things like that can be downright dangerous for large groups. The biggest problem with dominant narrative advocacy is that black people are supposed to hear accounts like mine and think, I could do better. In our minds, we're supposed to adopt the arrogance and narcissism of the dominant narrative, and instead of paying attention to all the signs that the dominant narrative has no intention of evolving or seeing its own faults, we're supposed to take up the mantle. For this reason, even as yet another woman candidate who was black was thwarted again by lying white women, instead of accepting that the United States is never going to entreat black women with respect, we're supposed to take up the fight. We are still supposed to be participating in the fake democracy that never truly listened to what black people had to say in an ostensibly long-lasting way. We are still supposed to recruit people to listen to the promises of institutions that have repeatedly failed and lied to us, hoping that if we just say it the right way, people will give us a chance to be free in the land of our birth. All advocacy within the dominant narrative is a lie, and that has not changed from the penning of the Declaration of Independence to the allowable public executions of black people occurring today. There has been no law that has made it illegal to charge black people more for existence, put us constantly in debt, defame us by using the press to spread propaganda, or harass/murder us. And more people have gotten away with making our lives miserable than have been held accountable. Everyone is afraid to side with us, believing that if they show that they support us, they will be targeted next. And comfort is a powerful drug, the most powerful narcotic sustaining the United States population. When we fight within the dominant narrative, there are so many rules, regulations, and biases that we are guaranteed to end up being in further distress or dead. With those as stipulations, it is not a wonder that many black people are ignoring the process, opting out, or choosing to leave the country. What is our motivation to stay when people are allowed to murder us without consistent repercussions? The biggest problem I see to communal understanding is that the dominant narrative refuses to understand that it is unethical to demand that any group of people constantly prove our humanity. Conservatives evidently want to go back to a time when they could enact pain on whomever they wished as long as that person could be deemed other by the dominant narrative. Their hatred is obvious, and it is presented on a regular basis without cessation. Whenever pain occurs, there's an unmitigated glee that so many traditionalists feel that they actively seek out those who oppose them, anticipating the cause of more pain. Over the past few months, we have seen no shortage of good old folks who have demonstrated how they never want to be held back on their violence in any way. Remember, folks, this animosity arose after one black president and one black vice president. Apparently, when certain people are considered subhuman, the thought of any becoming a figurehead is a sign of the apocalypse. Conversely, the liberal, progressive, centrist populations have no desire to move forward in a world where they too are held to the same standards as black people. They often want to return to a time when they were simply unaware of the harm they caused, and they idolize such ignorance in the form of being colorblind, offering cliches to fix legitimate issues. Similarly, they constantly delay any progress for non-white people because they are persistently demanding studies and legal reviews to ensure that white superiority and comfort are preserved. Most liberals, progressives, centrists have the delusional mindset indicating that we all have to keep believing in institutions, which are mostly white or led by white people. Furthermore, they demand that we keep proving our humanity or equality because deep down, they also believe that they are above us. Otherwise, none of the efforts under their leadership would have been delayed for any reason. They would have seen it as general progress as time continued. Joe Biden did irreparable damage to the country by not resigning in January 2024. If people had been able to observe at least 6 months of Kamala Harris's leadership, she might have had a fighting chance. Forgiving the student loans should have been at the beginning of his tenure, not the end, because placing it at the end to sustain his power made it more probable to be undone, which it was. Just like that white woman who thought she would go from unknown to federal senator, Harris had an impossible task. Biden and Ginsburg demonstrate that liberals, who are actually neoliberals, not socially liberal, are just as power hungry and racist as anyone else. And had Ginsburg stepped down under Obama and Biden resigned in January 2024, we might be looking at a very different world. I am grateful that Ginsburg went to her grave knowing that she had made a terrible mistake, and I hope Biden does too, especially having to live in the pain of his disease, which he expanded for people without federal health care or Secret Service officers. True to form, Biden treated Harris terribly, almost never stood up for her, and sabotaged her candidacy when it was time to step down and let someone else have a turn. Power-hungry bigots are not special because they are considered to be Democrats. In the words of the Bible we pretend to observe, ye shall know them by their fruits. Not nearly enough happened during Biden's presidency to validate his having been chosen in 2020, but I will say this. A vote for Harris would have done nothing but preserve the status quo. Trump's stimuli in 2020 were even larger than the stimulus under Biden, and I knew that was going to come back to bite him in the end. Saying pretty words and using black people is not cute, regardless of who is doing it. Even Biden's farewell speech was trash because most of the oligarchs became more powerful because of people like him, and just like Ginsburg, he will get to go to his grave understanding the damage he caused to the country. 2 civil rights efforts and no substantive changes should communicate that no transformation is going to happen under the dominant narrative. Anyone saying otherwise should talk to the countless black people who were told to let it go whenever there was any opportunity to enforce the Civil Rights Act. Laws are only as good as their enforcement, and just like those clowns in front of Tesla dealerships have shown, all law enforcement cares about is the protection of private property. Black people have seen that only if we are willing to invest in the participation slavery will our existence be deemed as relevant. Honestly, if someone is incapable of managing mercurial emotions long enough to avoid murdering people or making people homeless, that individual is no leader. No one is entitled to hold people hostage to mercurial emotions. I hope Harris finally understands how problematic it was for her to claim in 2021 that this isn't a racist country, because for me personally, I was done when she said that. Binary mindsets are by their very nature are narcissistic. And despite the mythology that everyone is calling everything narcissistic, I want people to consider the following concepts. First, it seems to be up for debate whether black people are capable of managing our own lives without white interference, which is indicated by the illusion that we are constantly taking government funds and jobs. Second, people believe that it is acceptable to destroy us, our communities, and our livelihoods in the name of progress and causing pain to us to enact policy that uplifts white populations is seen as acceptable collateral damage. Finally, the burden of proof is always on us to prove our humanity, regardless of the relentless smear campaign about our animal characteristics, criminal behavior, and hypersexual personalities since the beginning of the empire. Moreover, consider that more wars and international interference have occurred on the continent of Africa than any other continent, even when considering size. Resources anywhere in Africa are seen as fair game for the entire planet to consume, and people always talk about the violence, but never about the interference and why. The United States inspired both Nazism and apartheid, and then the empire demanded to be thanked and praised for solving the problems it created. When discussing history, people are commanded to repeat the same narratives about great white men with a couple of white women who all did everything themselves. Anyone demanding relief from the great white men are seen as violent obstacles to true civilization. Now, there is constant emotional abuse surrounding the revelations of truth in this country. School curriculums are being decimated to prevent the telling of how the empire truly rose, including the magical thinking that slavery was beneficial to black people because we learned skills. Only private educators are allowed to talk about the true meaning behind states' rights, including how the states can offer vigilantism as a solution to maintaining the dominant narrative. Calling the current regime on its obvious lies is deemed inappropriate, and anyone offering the slightest accountability is losing their job. Even the censure of Representatives Jasmine Crockett and Al Green is unsurprising because the truth is that both political parties in this country value the denigration of black people. Changing one's approach at denigration does not mean that one is not tearing someone else down, and likely these same people will be begging for them to come together even as they ignored and bullied them in public. In this way, I am pleased that there is a more open conversation about covert narcissism because for far too long, people have gotten away with tearing down black people in public and then sending us fake empathy in private. Rather than active and ongoing support, we are coerced into accepting the crumbs of social capital that never translates into anything more than words. At this point, refusing to be publicly anti-racist is just being racist. And all of those members of Congress outed themselves as bigots, as did the rest of the Democratic Party. People who continue to play the game of decorum are saying that nothing can be done until abusers feel comfortable. Honestly, what was the point of us getting degrees at predominantly white institutions when so many employers get off on punching down on BIPOC workers with degrees? No one asked the abusers for their behavior, and everyone will be suffering because the cowards tend to stand around hoping that someone else will solve the problems. I view Austin as a microcosm of the United States, and I have yet to be wrong. After all these outreach programs ended, half the people who were working on the city's behalf or in Austin had left and gotten out of contracting with the city. ATX Walk Bike Roll went through 2 city liaisons and 2 consultants. The Climate Equity Engagement Associate for the Climate Ambassador Program left. Even the City of Austin City Equity Officer left after the nightmare that was the equity anti-displacement tool and the inability of the city to stand for anything. Everyone thought that the advocates would be so happy to participate while the city pretended to respect our opinions that nobody thought we would be disgusted enough to leave with that behavior. Thanks to the legal delays and the fake focus group designed to stall it, Austin will never know if the equity anti-displacement tool would have been effective in making life easier for people of color, because diversity, equity, and inclusion work is now illegal both at the state and federal levels, and affirmative action was reversed by the Supreme Court. Only after the advocates disengaged and the watered down rules were introduced did the city post a position which would have included implementation of the equity anti displacement tool. West Austin still maintains control over whether any pro BIPOC ordinances are included, and now that there is no support or federal funding, most of the departments that are related to racial justice will likely be phased out, never to return. After a while, if someone is only willing to help others when they receive the bulk of the benefit, that individual has no interest in helping others. The unquestionable ambivalence about these programs proves two things. One, the dominant narrative enjoys the entertainment of assigned groups struggling for a benign existence. Two, the dominant narrative prefers that the targets internalize the fervent desire for people to attack us. We participated because we thought this would bring about changes, both politically and potentially on a socioeconomic level. What we found was a bunch of white people enjoying. What we found was that a bunch of white people enjoyed gushing about the BIPOC advocates they found. Right now, in the farce of democracy that is the corrupted two-party system, black people are getting baited left and right by people who had nothing to say when we were maintaining the status quo. Republicans want us out in the streets so they can exploit and murder us for their safety, and Democrats want us to be their mules and soothe their feelings. Nobody actually wanted any of the things we spent centuries fighting for, least of all equality. Black people have no reason to sacrifice ourselves for any of this garbage anymore. People have demonstrated that regardless of which party has political control, people will use us for what they need, ignore our humanity, and disassociate from us the second they have what they need. None of that is acceptable to us anymore. One concept is clear. BIPOC residents are expected to advocate for a tranquil existence while living our lives. For some reason, it never occurred to anyone that our lives should be ours to live, not others to manage. All the community engagement in the world will not stop the delusional belief that BIPOC individuals are unable to function without the help of experts and professionals. If such advocacy refuses to work for its end, the process becomes less about progress and more about appearances. People wanting to show black people how to do it the right way are merely seeking to control our efforts and maintain the dominant narrative. Therefore, I have some solutions for managing racism in the United States, but the main one is to stop waiting for people who have proven to be weak-willed cowards who stand for nothing but destruction at the expense of the vulnerable. 8 recent years of constant cultivation and education led to people lying in our faces yet again, and worse, people stabbing us in the back when they thought they were part of the dominant narrative. Not even white or rich, but people literally thought that there would be some magic that protected them while they harmed black people. Harming black people seems to be the national sport of the United States, so instead of thinking that we will ever be included as equal participants, it is time to release that notion. All we gain from pleading for our humanity is prolonged poverty within the dominant narrative, and people have the delusion that feeling bad about that is the same thing as addressing it. To exist in any kind of meaningful way, I only see 3 paths, all of which are relatively difficult for a myriad of different reasons. The first, and easiest, is to have enough money and be relatively okay. If one has advocated for themselves for any reason, kiss this situation goodbye, and that includes anything from challenging unfair labor practices to becoming a full-time advocate. The dominant narrative sees black people as batteries to use at its discretion, and people are too cowardly to ensure that we'll be fairly treated. Furthermore, there will be more technology, lower wages, and higher costs to come, and the ones with capital will not be looking to share vulnerability with people they consider beneath them. I did not say capitalist because broke people consider themselves capitalists, while people with capital actually understand their power. Secondly, this is a great time to leave the country and establish life elsewhere, doing research and building community, preferably before arriving. While empires have bred racism internationally, there are plenty of places where black people will be allowed to live our lives while other people mind the business that pays them instead of constantly needing to mind ours. The most important purpose of relocating should be to live a new life, not to emulate the life one might have had in the United States. The empire's lifestyle is expensive and wasteful, and we do not need to reconstruct imperialism somewhere else. Yes, there will be money involved, but it also matters what kind of life one is seeking. So if one is looking for a relatively small life with minimal outside interference, that kind of life is very possible. Third, if staying in the United States without enough money to ignore racism, accept that things will always be dysfunctional for black people and do not devote any resources into the vacuum called the work or the struggle. Pour only what is possible into small communities, and I do not necessarily mean the electoral system because that is an equally problematic situation where people are happy to use black labor and further excuse our oppression. Do not be bullied by people, including us, claiming that voting rights make us equal because all the numbers of our political participation have not improved our lot. When people claim to want to address racism but offer no money or compensation of any form, ask them directly why they think they have the right to control black time, energy, and resources. We never asked for oppression, but people seem to think that as long as black people are oppressed, everything is right with the world, so we need to stop feeding that craziness. Unless someone is approaching a black person with substantial money and behavior, no opportunities should be accepted. By substantial, I mean dominant narrative money, not the trash given to black people that they pretend was so difficult to acquire. Furthermore, the money and behavior should be offered gratefully, not with guilt trips, denigration, or other emotional manipulation tactics. When people make excuses for other circumstances, they too should be seen as perpetuating the dominant narrative and ignored henceforth. We need time and distance from solutions already presented to come up with different solutions. Unless we have real time to consider why the same solutions have not worked, we will continue to be stressed into repetition. The main reason that past ideology has not been unsuccessful The main reason that past ideology has been unsuccessful is because, based on demographics, it will be impossible to maintain a white majority, and the empire only functions on the premise of helping white people at the expense of everyone else. Welfare, Social Security, unemployment, those metrics only mattered if there was a substantial white population to assist. Now that the white population is slowly being diluted, there has been a push to borrow from or attack those assistant methods. Building more is environmentally unsustainable, and it is mathematically impossible for everyone on the planet to start a business. Even if we could all have separate cultures and no racial mixing, we would still have to all survive on the same planet. It is on the people doing wrong to stop, not on the people being targeted to convince them to stop targeting them. This excessive focus on what black people have done to stop the oppression has been a centuries-long focus on the wrong people. During an abusive relationship, the abuser likes to claim to only harm the target because of what the target did, which was a very effective way of organizing an economic expansion nation built on genocide and slavery. That way, it is the fault of indigenous people that they were slaughtered, and the fault of African people for getting captured. Racism in passive voice has been the most effective way of gaslighting targeted populations into internalizing our own harm. Unfortunately for the abusers, mental health information is now widely distributed, and black people particularly are no longer accepting the responsibility for people's need to harm us. With all the environmental degradation happening everywhere, it is time to leave the maladaptive people alone. There is no guarantee that the planet will remain hospitable, and it would be a waste to give the final years to people who enjoy telling everyone that everyone else is the problem, not them. How will anyone know who is maladaptive? It is obvious to see if people are authentically engaged by whether their words match their actions, or if they are grasping for attention while expecting everyone else to put forth the effort and keep themselves comfortable. Sadly, this is the majority of the population because the United States maintained so much comfort for so long, and almost nobody knows how to struggle and find joy. Those people will have to live in their individualistic mindsets, and everyone else needs to work to form community with those who remain. The only way to stop all the performative emoting is to stop giving people a stage or an audience. Many of them know that they are lying, and they need to know that everyone else is aware that they have no drive to evolve. So much of the advocacy seems to be predicated on the notion that black people are experiencing hurt feelings rather than strategic and deliberate violence. This is why the rampant belief persists that conversations and activities will cure deficiencies. There's little self awareness that our sensitivity is based on things that people actually did while sneering at our responses. After the first Trump election, there was a women's march with organizers who found almost no women of color until everyone pointed it out, and they scrambled at the last minute to change it. And even an Angela Peoples sign reminded the participants that women of color were not responsible. Later, despite a black woman organizing the Me Too movement, it was co-opted by the dominant narrative, so much so that the target of the Stanford rapist did not emerge until well after the event. These were women, but throughout this accounting, I've given examples of men, and if I gave all the examples where men co-opted the conversations, there would be very little else to my experience. Point being, there are several people who have been performing advocacy while changing nothing, and when people tried again after the second Trump election, nobody bothered with them. If attention is the currency in a capitalist society, then not demanding attention is the road to liberation. I know someone who is almost visibly uncomfortable when I mention their efforts because they made a point of doing so without gathering the attention of anyone. I am including the resources I expended to provide an example of how effort was expended but not reciprocated. When I called attention to the lack of reciprocation, the individuals in question retaliated with emotional abuse because that is an acceptable way of treating black women within the dominant narrative. Consequently, it is time for those within the dominant narrative to start doing without needing external validation. If those friendships were really that solid, people would not have needed to be told about them because they would be obvious. Last but not least, stop expecting people to clean up messes within a dysfunctional system that makes problems without attainable solutions. Life costs money for survival, and all of the people with the majority of the money are happily hoarding it, including the good ones who regularly do publicity stunts. If the majority of the people have no money, then expecting regular people without capital to solve sweeping problems with the meager resources we share is to be mentally unsound. No, black people do not have billions of hidden dollars to extract from because only the very few wealthy ones have money while everyone else is trying to survive. We are not going to fund extravagant elections and put on ridiculous galas and imitate whiteness for the rest of our engagement in the United States. There is real work to be done. No one seems to understand what a vote and a ballot actually are. By the time an item has been placed on a ballot or taken to a vote, it is the most diminished, worthless piece of trash designed to do less than nothing for mostly white people. If it destroys black people or the lower classes, no one blinks except us. Therefore, vote shaming us when we never elected to destroy ourselves and are the most energetic demonstrates racism at its height. Likewise, black people are disgusted by the use of celebrities and superstars as examples of how black people have never been targets because no one should have to be a celebrity to survive. That is quite possibly the most irrational and unhinged racist statement that there is in existence. Additionally, so many people mock younger people about wanting to be famous. None of that behavior makes sense. Recently, I told a friend that if I had known that all the work I did keeping up the deciphercity.org website and all the walking and talking would lead to nothing, then I might not have done it. I had previously had a day job at the IRS that I left for the private sector, so maybe I would have switched to part-time in the evenings and or weekends. Then I would have had regular income and overtime during the pandemic, and I would not have been so vulnerable, and maybe I would have gotten out of debt. Of course, I might still have found value in the dominant narrative, and then I would have continued wearing myself thin, and I would not have learned to ignore most of the baiting. Knowing that advocacy leads to nothing within the dominant narrative is a very valuable lesson, and most people failed to learn it until Trump got reelected. I remember thinking that I thought information should be free, but I later realized that the information is free, but the cultivation of it is not. So many hours were spent crafting articles and searching the city minutes that I will never get back. So much outreach was done that I actually paid to do, and for people who think that people have to spend money to make money, that means that the only people who make any money are people who already have it. That was just me. So consider how many black women who worked countless hours on their feet, maintaining marriages and families, holding down paid labor, and somehow being the fabric of their communities. None of that was free for us, but we did it because we thought there would be a better response this time. Not only were we all wrong, but people expect us to offer the same kind of services with less time and money, fewer jobs, and no possibility of penetrating the minds of those with power and control. It takes a special kind of stupid to think that people are going to spend decades up to the last 10 years organizing, educating, and investing in change just to get nothing back, not even the policy changes that were advertised. Learning that nothing we do will change behavior is part of liberation from the dominant narrative, and those who make us feel guilty are not worth relationships. Abusers will always seek targets because they need to prove dominance. Some comfortable people are tired of all the work done for resistance since the election, but black people are seeing that a lot of folks think emotional manipulation is work. To a certain extent it is, because maintaining a delusion and or facade takes a lot of energy, and it would be impossible to maintain it forever without ever letting it slip. On the contrary, anything comfortable, easy, or safe is not activism, and people who think activism is a hobby are in the way of people doing actual work. Furthermore, people need to stop listening to those who pander to the dominant narrative's need to play the victim or forgo responsibility for the harm they cause. One reason that narcissism is being so heavily discussed now is that people have finally seen the harmful pattern caused by enabling so much abusive behavior. When older people harmed others, people would say, they're from a different time, so you have to understand. When younger people followed through with what their parents taught them, it was, they're young, and they have no idea what they're doing. Robin DiAngelo and Brene Brown have made millions pandering to the worst behavior, calling bigots fragile, and telling everyone that such people are vulnerable. No, all of the examples of people I just described are narcissistic, in which the key component is harming others, taking no accountability, and falsifying victimhood. Everyone is accountable for their own behavior, and everyone else is not responsible to enable abuse. Running to institutions seems to be all most people know how to do, whether that is social media, the news, universities, the government, or private industry. In a way, I am thankful for all this anti-black policy since 2020 because everyone between 18 and 80 saw that whatever gains made will face retaliation and be dismantled once the illusion of progress is complete. The changing world and advanced corruption means that the wins are smaller and difficult to strategize, and all of it depends on the whims of cooperative authorities. Nobody is blowing up my phone anymore, not just because I tend to ignore people now, but because I was not the one who failed to follow through. And no one can argue that politely advocating for change is helpful anymore. All those people have received the slap in the face they deserve, and they will probably take a while to recover. Ironically, no one is asking about the white dominance in all institutions, meaning that if someone continues to run to institutions, they are implicitly demanding that white people stay in control. Even when there are black leaders in the institutions, nobody respects them, advocates for them, works diligently with them, or accepts the difficulties it takes to be in such positions. A leader is only as good as the people who support that leader. And if everyone is looking for a reason to ignore what a black person says because reasons, the leader has no support. There is nothing to be gained in begging for a seat at the table when the only thing that people seem to want is for black people to be served on the menu. To everyone's disgust, not only will people not support a leader, they will actively join in creating a hostile environment while expecting black people to remain. All these cowards want to shrink back and not stand for anything, but want to call themselves allies. I don't know what to do. You just need to vote. Tell me what to do. No, we can't do that. Now that the events are finally affecting people other than black people, everyone is running up to us with the same pathetic sorry and thank you that they had after the murder of George Floyd. Nobody cares anymore, especially since there is an underlying expectation to keep supporting those who have caused harm and to make excuses for terrible people. Black people do not hold the responsibility of all egos and comfort on our shoulders. Everyone who thinks otherwise is justifying violence, harassment, and stalking. That's too simplistic. No, I would argue that it is far from simplistic to live off the assumption that I have to manage everyone else's comfort. What I have often seen is that people disregard the control aspect of slavery, but they hyper-focus on the violence that they have studied. Slavery was never only about extraction of wealth. It was about the sadistic desire to have people under complete and total control to whom anything could be done. There would be no responsibility or accountability other than having to find another one. Despite a limited number of circumstances, there is still that sadistic desire for control, but it manifests in different ways, such as demanding that people go to hostile offices with human resource departments which are trained to hate and punish black people. Another manifestation is to expect black people to go to public meetings knowing full well that nobody will listen to or respect our opinions. Most importantly, the mindset that one should rarely or never offer black people anything but gaslight us into believing that we have been given everything is part of that sick need for control. So many people believe that racism implies an unwillingness to engage, but forget that hatred and indifference have many forms. Such hatred is expressed by demands to exploit, repeated public denigration, desires to torture professionally, emotionally, and physically, and of course, execution, all of which are steps towards control. One thing people accepted into the dominant narrative never consider is that there are literally millions of people doing eons of work that no one ever sees. To say that attention is the only thing that matters is to disrespect them. If the world is not going to function any differently, but keeps using BIPOC advocates as the audience for poor behavior, we're simply observing contempt. People are not owed time and energy for getting their lives in order. Moreover, all of this obnoxious defensiveness about not owning slaves mean that people understand the issue is control, and they are not willing to acknowledge that. Deflecting to slavery when coercing someone to submit to unearned authority is not part of equality, and control with a smile is still control. People refuse to acknowledge when they have denigrated or refused black leadership, and they refuse to believe that black people have contributed anything because if we have, they know they owe us. Unfortunately, when cornered, most individuals are very dangerous, and the revelation of the consistent need to control means that all the masks of smiles and performative behavior are no longer effective. This era is all control. And if people are participating in these activities, they are not allies. No one cares about conversations, dialogues, or anything else that translates to performative, unpaid emotional labor. If no behavioral changes are on the table, there is nothing to discuss. Conversations involve meetings of the mind. So if someone demonstrably thinks that the other is less than they are, conversation is impossible. If no one is committed to changing behavior, then all conversations are a waste of time. The world is not required to cater to a caste that emotionally immature people created to satisfy their own sick desires. Because the dominant narrative is pushing the propaganda that such behavior is normal, people have mistakenly believed that it is normal to demand control over others. Even when people know that their behavior is atrocious, they claim human nature because they refuse to admit that dominance is not always human nature, but the limited mindset of a selective few. However, because the United States has been conditioned to believe that some people should have control over select others, control was established as a subconscious trait that has mutated into the current liberal behavior. When determining the meaning of an apology, consider that domestic abusers apologize all the time. They never mean it, but they realize that in the moment, their impulses are denying their efforts for desired control. Pushback against such control was seen as mean, angry, or crazy, and it can come in a variety of forms, including the simple act of saying no. For anyone who behaves as if a black person is some kind of project that they get to present, that is not treating us like human beings. If people truly believe that we are human beings, then what right do they have to demand that we prove our humanity before the dominant narrative stops harassing and stalking us? It seems like that makes it about a need to control and not our problem, and we are not responsible for the behavior of others. When people keep saying that fighting racism is a marathon, I would point out that I am no longer running any of the marathons that I started years ago. Every race has an end, and if there is no end, that is because the organizers wanted to keep going. No, we do not have to run some kind of marathon to prove to psychopaths that we are okay. And every non-black person we meet is not the arbiter of our humanity. We're allowed to reject bids for dominance. And if people throw tantrums because they were not given enough deference to their entitlement, we are allowed to stay away from them. Our humanity and autonomy are not up for negotiation, and no one cares about any number of black people. Anyone knows. No is a complete sentence for everyone on the planet, and we are not going to keep repeating the no while enduring unrelenting coercion. To those who say that I did not ask enough from the black community during my advocacy, I can only sigh and shake my head. We have a nasty habit in this country of making the targets of abuse responsible for their abusers' behavior. If they had only complied with unreasonable requests that they had no hope of fulfilling because the abusers were hoping for defiance to excuse horrific behavior. Nobody wants to work for unreasonable conditions that do not fulfill even the costs that employers want to charge people for a living. Why do people have to insist on living our lives without unreasonable interference and constant defensiveness from people we are actively avoiding because they are volatile? No, black people are not responsible for being chosen as targets by oppressive comfort fiends who think that they are blameless regardless of the offenses they commit. Of course we have networks. Otherwise, how could we survive what others have done? Long ago, I stopped chasing down targets for the actions of their abusers, and I suggest that everyone else do the same. Racial hatred is not some cute trend that can be reversed with a new election. Long-term damage persists, regardless of the narrative people tell themselves. Because people think doing the work is getting attention and praise for the edgiest viewpoint, their commitment to change extends as far as the attention and praise carry them. When racial justice is out of fashion, people find a new trend rather than confirming if something substantive was actually done. Saying that attention leads to change is like saying one is going to marry someone they meet in a club. Hypothetically, they could, but it would be more rational to believe that someone dedicated to marital practices will get married, not change their worldview. There are too many other factors at play to assume mere attention will lead to changed behavior. In October 2025, at one of my jobs, 2 activists within the dominant narrative came in to strategize and identify themselves as activists. I knew the group they were with, and I recognized that not much about the situation had changed the minute they opened their mouths. They told me that they were friends, and when I mentioned that I too had been an organizer, they got that manic gleam in their eyes, the one that communicates an opening of a siphon for my time, energy, and resources. When I told them that I no longer organized, the white woman, because of course there was a white woman, condescendingly said that everyone gets burnt out. And I responded, no, sometimes people need to give up on a system that hates them. She took the hint and walked away, but the Latino organizer with her decided to keep strategizing and to entice me. And one of his aces was a book he had read that he thought I should read. Families are being separated, children are being caged, the government was shut down, and he wanted to talk to me about a book. This is the kind of vapid engagement that has pushed marginalized people away from the game forever, and no amount of fake smiling is going to change that situation. These were union organizers, but as I have said elsewhere, union effectiveness depends on an entity responding to the union. All through my email, I have seen that the National Treasury Employees Union, which is so good that paid time off and sick time are immediately earned upon employment with the Internal Revenue Service, regardless of position, has spent most of the year in court. No positive outcomes have occurred with the reductions in force, just continued legal battles while employees continue to struggle. That union is long standing and well established, and even they have no hope to offer their members. Eventually, even the book learner understood that I was not interested in his nonsense and finally found the grace to disengage. These two kids, basically, thought they would come onto a corporate campus with some t-shirts and smiles and convince employed individuals to pick a fight with our employers. Social media, as well as general adherence to the dominant narrative, has dissolved people's capacity to think. All over the media, unions are being ignored, and people are losing benefits left and right, benefits that were hard-won necessities that individuals are struggling without. And that is fact. No protests, selfies, yelling or crying into phones, or meetings will make anyone listen to newly created unions under an administration that does not recognize unions. In all honesty, unions were an old tool of the dominant narrative, and they allowed a lot of white people to keep their power. At this point in time, unions are ineffective, and those within the dominant narrative are endangering people by not recognizing that salient point. Voting is over, unions are over, starting a small business is over. All the tools to combat the imperial dominant narrative have been eviscerated. No groups with excited people are the answer to crystal fascism. Jane Elliott once posed the question of whether anyone would trade places with a black person. Well, Project 2025 described how white people would be treated the same way they treat black BIPOC individuals, and they're all panicking and trying to backtrack. For those defensively posturing about all their anti-racist friends, they never stop to consider that such people always know how to put up a front, and folks will literally murder others to maintain a narrative. I once told a particularly defensive individual, "You know them as you don't know them as me." No one is owed praise for an inability to process dysphoric emotions. Instead of asking people to tolerate poor treatment, people need to start asking how much recovery energy they want to feel from everyone harmed by poor behavior. Emotional maturity demands that people start asking the costs that the effects will have on their lives. The need for constant happy endings comes from a vapid mindset devoid of responsibility for the consequences of their own actions. Control is not friendship, no matter who someone voted for. Control is not collaboration, because someone is refusing to collaborate by demanding to be in charge of the project. Control is not love, and demanding that everyone soothe feelings and self-negate for the greater good is saying that some people should understand that they are inherently below everyone else. My conclusion is that liberals enjoy watching black people struggle from a disaffected distance, and no one can work with people who need to see them as entertainment or validation machines. What is more likely, that all these people are confused and shamed and need to learn, or that they are confused and shamed because they know what they did was wrong and they are stalling for time? All of the come together without white vulnerability wasted all the time that they had. And now they get to experience the joy of everyone blaming them for the problems and offering none of the help. Activism is an attempt by marginalized communities to trigger social cognition. However, if an audience is maladaptive, such efforts are too much of a strain on the communities to reasonably justify engagement. It is the job of those within the dominant narrative to redeem themselves, not our job to validate. We cannot work with people who want us to fail. We will not take responsibility for choices made on information that no one bothered to verify. Part of creating a better society means leaving those who need abuse and those who demand control to their own devices. Our responsibilities are to regain our senses of self and work to create better communities in spite of the controlling minorities. We need to recognize that if we actually examine their self proclaimed importance, no one would care because it is fake. It is time to let delusionists cling to their delusions while the rest of us advance. All the community and the engagement in the world will not appease people who are incapable of hearing a no.